Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my VermiBag Mini, preparing to check in on the red wiggler worms that live in here. And I'm kind of getting this impression, just at first glance, but I could be mistaken, that I don't really see something that I think we would normally see when we would come in here, which is the presence of flying insects. But, alright, right there I could see one walking around. But in the past, you would see quite a few more. I think over here, too, I could see a couple. I've been noticing flying insects in greater numbers in some of my systems lately. So I've been breaking out the old Mosquito Dunks. But in the past, I had always taken the Mosquito Dunks and put it into water and created a solution out of it that I would spray into my systems. And more recently, I've just been taking the Mosquito Dunks and putting it dry into my blender to create that powdery, flaky substance that I apply to my systems. So I'm gonna not assume that everything's hunky-dory in here. I'm gonna do what I've been doing in most of my systems, which is to simply come in with the stuff and make sure that it's been applied. Just as a countermeasure, perhaps more as a preventative measure, if in fact we've managed to snuff out whatever flying insects were beginning to make themselves at home in here. I guess this little seed was making itself at home in here too, attempting to grow, but now it's been transformed from a youthful plant into a extra little bit of worm food. So we left a nice coating of leaves out here on the surface when we last checked in. That last check-in 12 days ago was feeding number 53, I believe. So I believe we're up to feeding number 54 on the systems. Let me see if I can remember the age. It was 647 last time, 12 days ago, so 659. And there's been some discussions already in the comments from the previous videos in terms of when harvest of this system might occur. Because those of you who've been with me for a few years might remember the previous incarnation of the VermiBag, which went for 700 days, at which point it was harvested, but it was harvested in a somewhat unconventional fashion, because systems like these are classified as continuous flow-through systems, which means the material keeps getting loaded in on top, the bedding and food, and when it comes time to harvest, the way that's done is by opening up a hatch on the bottom and just ejecting a certain amount of the material. That sounds a little bit scary. It still intimidates me because I've yet to ever do it. Because I didn't harvest this system in that fashion when the time came after 700 days last time. I treated it more like a conventional system, and I didn't just remove some of the material out the bottom, leaving the remaining stuff to settle and continue, but rather I simply ejected the entire contents. But I didn't eject it per se, I removed it. I pulled it out through the top. So what do we have here? In recent check-ins, I've noticed little bits of cabbage coming across when I would bump into it like this as being super fresh, kind of crunchy even in a way, showing very little sign of breakdown. And it was just a couple days ago that when I encountered some cabbage that had hardly shown any signs of breakdown, it even showed some signs of growth on the little chunk of the stem that was in there. So I extracted it all and put it back in my freezer. Today's feeding does include a little bit of that same type of cabbage I found to be growing in one of my other systems. It's Savoy cabbage. And here too you can see a little piece of the stem over here that came out with this core piece of the cabbage, as well as some of the not so nice leaves on the outside. So I'm taking another stab at giving the worms cabbage, but this stuff's definitely been in the freezer for some time. The stuff that I saw growing, I suspect, might have been fed to the system prior to being thoroughly frozen. There's other things over here too that they're getting. A lot of this looks to me like cucumber. I think I actually took the time to slice the cucumber into little pieces. There's other things here too. This red stuff might be onion, and it's a pretty decent portion. I've also got coffee that we can include with today's feeding. As I excavated the feeding zone here, I didn't really see much other than that chunk of cabbage as far as leftovers go. I mean, here we have the stem of a banana, the sort of thing that will stick around. And then these other two objects that we pulled out earlier are pumpkin stems. This one came in later. This one came in with the worms. So even though the system is over 650 days of age, this pumpkin stem is over 700 days in service, because it came with the worms when the worms were loaded into this bag, because they were already starting to work on this thing in their previous systems. These worms used to occupy yellow buckets. Oh, here we go. See right here, more examples of cabbage trying to grow in the worm bin. See this little thing right here? Little shoot trying to grow off what had been the stem or a portion of the stem. I'm wondering if we're going to end up doing the same thing here as I did in the other system where we saw the same thing a couple days ago. I mean, here this looks to me just like a piece of leaf, which might be kind of slow on the breakdown, but doesn't appear to be sprouting or attempting to grow. And I can even sense the cabbagey smell of this stuff. The other system in which I found leftover cabbage bits, the stem pieces had all kinds of little growth sticking out of it. This piece of stem had one little growth sticking out of it. So perhaps we'll just give this piece another chance at continuing here within the bin without me perhaps overreacting and extracting it and putting it back in the freezer. But that's what I ended up doing with what I found last time. I pulled it out, put it back in the freezer in the hopes that at some future point in time the material will have thoroughly frozen through, and when we give it to some worm bin again in the future, it'll actually get used as worm food. Worms don't really go after stuff that they sense to be still alive and actively growing, so it doesn't really end up being very good worm food if it just ends up sitting in the system attempting to grow, causing the worms to basically ignore it. But I guess this little bit of cabbage here, we're going to give it a second try. I've been noticing in this system how nice and moist everything is without me needing to apply any water. And that's because a few months ago I wrapped the outside of the bag with some plastic, helping the system to hang on to its moisture content and not need any supplementary moisture being added. So I'm still feeling like we're okay, but the material doesn't seem quite as damp. Perhaps it's just because of where I'm coming from right now today, which is a day after dealing with two of my systems that I found to be extremely damp. I mean, muddy to the point where it was, you know, almost ridiculous. And maybe it's just, you know, the way this stuff here feels relative to what I saw yesterday. I'm not going to overreact. I'm going to just assume that we're good in here. Don't forget, the stuff that we're adding includes things like cucumber. It's a pretty juicy vegetable. And even this very heavily frozen cabbage, I'd like to think is going to begin expelling some of its moisture content as it begins to break down. So let's go ahead and just give this stuff a try. If it ends up trying to grow, then we could always send it down the path of plan B, which is to see if we can pull it out and throw it into the freezer and give it another try elsewhere. So the very old pumpkin stem that came in with these worms from their old system, this one that had been at one point huge, I don't mess with unless I accidentally bump into it and knock off a chunk of it. But this one here, I'm more than happy to help it along to the finish line by trying to chip off pieces of it if I'm able. So let's get those right back down in there. And last time I liked what we did. We laid in a little bit of bedding like we just did with that feeding zone indicator, which I'm wondering why I did that. We should probably hang on to that coffee filter. Doesn't matter. Feeding zone indicators seem meaningless in this system because I always feed down the middle. There's never any sort of question as to where the feeding zone was in here, so perhaps we'll just forget about it. Use it as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zone, and now even more bedding in addition to those few bits of paper we just threw in. Now we put in my cucumber, onion, and I've also got a nice portion of coffee we could sprinkle in here. So that's their feeding. Looks pretty good. Last time we definitely had a little bit of a worm party going on. So I even did a couple of those little clips where I pull out a handful and we observe them. In this case, it seemed like the worms were a little bit more scattered about, and perhaps that's just because the food we gave them last time, whatever food they were able to consume, was eaten, and then the worms continued roaming around looking elsewhere in the system for other things to eat, not really resulting in any sort of a worm party or anything like that down in here. And that's good, you know. It is fun to come back into the system and find a little worm party going on, but it is also nice to see that they've managed to deplete all or most of the food we gave them previously, kind of reinforcing you know, the fact that they were in fact in need of some more food, and we came in at a timely interval. So let's leave them once again with a nice coating of leaves on the top here. I always like the way this stuff looks, and once we cover up with plastic, the system's moisture attempting to exit the bin through evaporation gets caught, condensing on the plastic and dropping back down, causing all this surface material to have a nice moisture content. So much so that it sticks to the plastic. And I assume that we'll see more of that next time. If I continue to get the sense that perhaps moisture in here is a bit lacking, then we could always apply a somewhat juicier food type, or we could always come back in here with my water bottle, which is something we haven't done recently, but we could always apply moisture directly in the form of water with my spray bottle. But for now, I'm still thinking things in here look pretty nice from a moisture perspective, so we're going to let it ride. That's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.